Chapter 14, Forgetting the Constitution. Haruko Obata lived in a house in a lovely tree-shaded Berkeley, California. Her father was a professor at the University of California. Haruko was an American citizen. Like most Japanese Americans, she was proud of her Asian heritage, but she didn't approve of the ways of the warlords who ruled the Japanese Empire. In school, she studied the Constitution and its guarantees. She was happy to live in the land of liberty. Then, one day, Haruko's world changed. Her father came home and told the family they were moving. They had just a few days to get ready. They could take only as much as they could carry. They might never see the things they would leave behind. They were going to live against their wishes in a prison-like camp. What had they done? Just a minute, and I'll get to that. But first, imagine that you are Haruko. You have some hard decisions to make, and you need to make them quickly. What will you choose to take with you? Sorry, your dog can't go. You'll have to give her away. Books, games, toys? Not if they're heavy. No one knows exactly where this camp is. It may be very cold or hot. You won't be able to take much besides clothes. Your parents must sell the car, the house, almost all their possessions. Because they do it so quickly, they will get hardly anything for them. You and your family are going to a camp that is surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Armed guards stand in watchtowers. If someone tries to walk into the desert, he will be shot. What have you done that is so terrible? Why are you and your family in this prison camp? You have not done anything wrong. Yes, you read that right. The Obatas have done nothing at all. They have been fine citizens. But they are of Japanese descent, and the United States is at war with Japan. There is an anti-Japanese hysteria in America, especially in California. Some of it is understandable. War is terrible. The Japanese government is horrible. But the Japanese in America have nothing to do with that. Some people don't understand that. Many authorities expect the Japanese to attack the West Coast. A Japanese submarine fires shells that land harmlessly near Los Angeles. People are terrified. There are rumors that Japanese American fishermen are sending signals to Japanese ships and planes. There is no evidence of this, but in wartime, how can anyone be sure? Reports of Japanese atrocities in Nanking, China, and elsewhere are terrible and turn out to be true. But Japanese Americans have nothing to do with that, just as German Americans have nothing to do with the savagery in Nazi Germany. Most Japanese Americans feel anguish. They love the United States, its opportunities, and its inspiring vision. But they also take pride in their ancient Japanese heritage. For them, World War II is like a civil war. In addition, the Japanese in America face an old problem: racism. A racist law prevents Japanese immigrants from becoming citizens. However, anyone born here is automatically an American citizen. 2/3 of the Japanese Americans are Nisei, the Japanese word for those born in America, and they are citizens. The war brings very real fear, and the racists use that against the Japanese. There is something else here too. It is greed. Japanese Americans have been industrious. Their property is valuable. If they are put behind barbed wire, their property will have to be sold, and quickly, for much less than it's worth. Some people will profit mightily. The first calls for internment, putting Japanese in camps, come from newspaper columnists. Then a group of West Coast politicians join in. They include Earl Warren, who will later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Attorney General reminds the Secretary of War that the Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. The 14th Amendment says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. But we are at war, and the War Department is worried about national security. The right of habeas corpus has been shelved in wartime before. President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9102. 120,000 Japanese Americans have a few days to get ready. They will be sent to 10 different internment camps. There is so much more to this story, much, much more. Mostly, it is of a people who, as soon as they got settled, didn't cry. They did their best in a bad situation. They planted seeds and grew crops. They raised farm animals. They fed themselves and sent their surplus to support the war effort. They fixed up their sleeping quarters. They established schools, churches, recreational centers, newspapers, scout troops, baseball teams, and their own camp governments. Some were let out of the camps to work in war factories. Many became soldiers. A Nisei regiment fighting in Europe won more commendations than any other regiment in the whole United States Army. Infantryman Harry Takaki explained, "We were fighting for the rights of all Japanese Americans. We set out to break every record in the Army. If we failed, it would reflect discredit on all Japanese Americans. We could not let that happen." More than 16,000 Nisei served in the Pacific, most in military intelligence work as interpreters. Some went behind enemy lines as American spies. Japanese American women volunteered and served in the Women's Army Corps as nurses and in the Red Cross. At first, people in the War Department objected to the idea of Nisei serving in the Army, but finally President Roosevelt spoke up. He said, "The principle on which this country was founded, and by which it has always been governed, is that Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart. Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry." Eventually, the camps were closed and people went out and did their best to build new lives. It wasn't easy. They had lost all their possessions. Many still faced racism when they tried to find jobs and new homes. 40 years after the end of the war, the American government officially apologized to Japanese Americans for the terrible injustice done to them during World War II. Those who had been in the camps were given money and partial payment for their suffering. Today, when we Americans think back on the internment camps, we feel shame.